Mike Bernard back with us on Inside the Numbers, GameDaySportsRadio.com on a Friday morning. Mike, how are you doing?
Doing well, Coach. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well, but watched a little football last night, and so actually some pretty good games, entertaining games, say the least. Especially the Jack State game, came back and won that in overtime after being down 21-7 in the first half. So that was a good game to watch. And listen, we've got a good game. We've got good games this weekend. I think one of the better ones is tonight. And Mike, listen, you're a handicapper. I'm not. That being said, you've got to show me this week on some of these games what Vegas is seeing, and I'm not. Take, for instance, tonight's game. Number 10, Utah. Number 19, Oregon State. And I know Utah's traveling up to Oregon State, but listen, the Beavers are favored by 3.5 points, and the only Power 5 game they played was versus Washington State, and they lost. And again, I know they're at home, but what am I missing here?
Well, actually, they're now favored by 4 or 4.5. And Coach, we've talked about this at least once every year. This is a good example of why polls and records don't matter when it comes to setting the point spread, right? So you have number 10, Utah, undefeated, going to number 19, Oregon State. So it doesn't make much sense on the surface. But look, the odds makers, the power rankings count more than polls and records. That's always been the case. In this game in particular, Clemson transfer quarterback, DJ Ungalele, he had a bad game. So that's another reason why you would think that Oregon State might not be laying this type of number. And then Utah, they're undefeated. It looks like a trap. The right play here is Oregon State over thousands of games.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like a trap, but here's the other thing. Utah, the last 15 times they've been on the road as an underdog, they've covered 13 of those. But I lean to Oregon State here. I don't have a position on it, but if I did, it would be with the favorite.
Number 8, USC at unranked Colorado. This is a Saturday 12 noon kick, 11 Central kick on Fox. Now, Buffaloes, they finally got a taste of a good team last week. Oregon could have named the score. And now the Trojans come calling. USC prohibitive favorite, anywhere depending upon where you're looking, anywhere between 21 and 22.5 points. No doubt the Trojans are a better team here. But, Mike, this is a 10 o'clock a.m. local kick there in Boulder. For Lincoln Riley's crew, it's like kicking off at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, does Vegas take factors such as this into consideration?
Remember, Vegas sets the number. Handicappers shape and mold the number from that point on. And, yeah, that is a factor, but it's not a case of where USC is going over to play Boston College across the way. So it's not in this particular case. I believe it's going to wash out. It's going to affect both teams equally. The bottom line in this game is Colorado was a great story, but their offensive line is extremely weak. Travis Hunter, a rare two-way player who's one of the best players in all of college football, he's out again. And you know what you and I always talk about history, and USC is 16-0 against Colorado. They'll be 17-0 after this week.
Unranked 4-0 Kentucky favored by 1 at home versus number 22 Florida. Noon kick on ESPN. Again, this is one of those situations where the unranked team is actually favored over the ranked team. The Wildcats pretty much untested. The Gators, they've been Jekyll and Hyde a lot. They couldn't get out of their own way in Provo, but then they look like world beaters against Tennessee. And, maybe Tennessee's lack of enthusiasm that Saturday night had something to do with that. But, again, this is another one I look at and kind of scratch my head just a little.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. Unranked favorite versus ranked opponents is an angle I always look at because, again, over time, the unranked favorite over the ranked team is going to cover more often than not. And one thing about it's not too long ago that Florida had beaten Kentucky 31 consecutive times. So even when Kentucky had a great team, it didn't matter. They were going to get beat like stepchildren, and they did for 31 straight years. But that intimidation factor is gone because the Cats have won the last two. They've won 3 of the last 5. So they don't have that emotional hurdle anymore. One thing I'll say, and I haven't mentioned his name since last season, but Billy Napier, you can't trust him. He doesn't know when to go for 2. It hasn't cost him a game yet, but he doesn't know when to take a knee. That's going back to Louisiana days. And I'm sorry, and I know that a lot of coaches don't understand game theory, but when you don't know when to go for 2 and you don't know when to take a knee, I can't trust you. And so if I had to lean here, it would be Kentucky.
SEC CBS featured afternoon game, undefeated and number 1 Georgia is only a 14.5-point favorite in Jordan-Hare versus Auburn. Tigers coming.
You say only.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, the Bulldogs, they're a known quantity, but after watching the Tigers against A&M, I'm surprised Georgia isn't favored by 50.
Look, Georgia's beaten Auburn 6 straight times. 5 of those were by 3 scores or more. So I understand when you look at the line and say, why isn't it more? Well, they just don't want to – the casinos and sports books don't want to get lopsided. They don't want everything on one side or the other, in most cases, that is. Georgia's on a 21-game win streak. Everything's in their favor. I don't have a position in this game, but if I had to play in a contest or make a small wager, I would play Auburn just on – it just looks to me like it would be too easy for the general public to lay 14 or 15 points with a Georgia team that doesn't lose.
Number 13, LSU visiting number 20, Ole Miss in Oxford. Both these teams come in 3-1. This is a 5 Central Time kick on ESPN, 6 Eastern. I think LSU, they've got a pretty good resume. I mean, you look at their one loss, and it was to Florida State. And, yeah, it was an ugly loss. But I think Florida State's a pretty dang good football team. But the LSU Tigers going into Oxford only a 2-point favorite against the Rebels. But, history, I look back, LSU has had some tough times in Oxford, even against bad Ole Miss teams.
They have Ole Miss. They have the respect of the odds makers, that's for sure. Last week, they were only getting 6.5 or 7 in Tuscaloosa. Normally, when you see Alabama laying 7 or less, it's not good for Alabama. It was the case last Saturday. They did get the win by 2 touchdowns. They're getting Rebels getting 2.5 at home this week. Remember last year, Coach, Ole Miss was 7-0 and ranked, 7 or 8, depending on which meaningless poll you look at. But that team went to Baton Rouge and they lost by 25 points. They lost 45-20. Rebels fell apart after that. They started 7-0, finished 8-5. LSU, we know their talent level. They're erratic, but I would lean to the Tigers here.
The late SEC game on ESPN, number 12, Alabama, mentioning Alabama, and going over to Starkville, making that 90-minute drive over to Starkville, taking on Mississippi State. Tied 3-1 right now, just only lost to Texas, and a 14.5-point favorite over the Bulldogs. Bulldogs come in at 2-2. You look at Alabama, they were better, had some success last week versus Ole Miss. I think this week will tell us about Alabama if those guys now think they've reached a comfort level after last week. And by that, I mean, do they think they're going to win just because they're wearing a crimson helmet? I guess the best question to ask is that, can this Tide team handle the little bit of success that they've had thus far?
Right. Look, Alabama is a good team. Nowhere near Alabama good. This team power rates lower than any Tide squad since Saban's first year in 2007. And I know people they said they're going to say I said the same thing last year. And they're right. I did. And if it weren't for Superman at quarterback, they would have lost 4 games instead of only 2 games. And it's not the power rating is not subjective. Okay. The power rating that I'm speaking of has to do with if you put Alabama on a neutral field versus Ohio State or any other, that's how we use our power ratings. And this year and last year rank lower than any of Saban's other teams. And it doesn't mean they can't become a great team. The reason that they're not a super elite Alabama team, in my opinion, is they don't have the super elite receivers. Coach, think back to that 12-year span. They had guys, they're all in the league or been in and out of the league. Those, elite receivers are running wide open down the field. And Bryce Young didn't have it last year, and they certainly don't have it this year. And that's the reason, because everywhere else, position-wise, they seem to be solid. So good players, not great players in the skill positions. To this particular game, we talked about how Kentucky no longer has that hurdle to beat Florida. Mississippi State has the hurdle to beat Alabama because Alabama's beaten them 15 straight times. I don't think they'll win this week, but I do think they have a really good chance of keeping it close against the Tide.
All right, Mike, we appreciate your time as always, and we'll have you back on just a little bit later to talk some NFL numbers, and then we'll talk to you again on Monday when we get a chance to sit down and look back and see how accurate we were for the week.
Sounds good, Coach. I always enjoy it, and we'll talk Monday.